Hello, we are currently in a sermon series at Highrock called Women Who Led the Way, and we're meeting some women throughout history, from the scriptures all the way up till today, who have made a tremendous impact for the kingdom. And this past Sunday, we heard an amazing sermon from Pastor John explaining how it is that the scriptures give strong encouragement for women being in ministry. But we know that the reality on the ground can be very different. So today I'm joined by three women who are in different stages of pursuing a call to ministry, and we wanted to hear about their stories. What's it really been like? What is it like now? How could it be in the future as we follow God in this way? And so I want to start off with Adele Calhoun. Adele, would you tell us, how did you get into ministry? And describe the process of discerning a call.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a home where women ministers, of course, were not common or proper, but I saw missionaries. And I knew very early on that I wanted to serve God. When the offering plate came along, I put in my whole purse to represent my whole. I wanted to take the plate and step in it, and my mom would take it back. So I had this heart for God from the very beginning. But I never thought about the pastorate. And so after teaching high school for a year, I became a missionary with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, which works with college students. And I was 2.5 years in Southeast Asia. And it was just this sense of, I love doing this. I love working with students. So that was my entry into seminary. I knew that I needed more training. Japanese students I worked with had actually read Paul Tillich, and I was like, Paul Tillich? I don't know anything about Paul Tillich. So my mentors in IFES encouraged me to go to seminary. I was in Asia. I applied to Gordon Conwell, Denver Seminary, just decided I'd go and see where God led me. I was not thinking about pastoral ministry, just preparing myself. There were 30 women in seminary when I was in seminary. All the rest were men, and very few people thought that women would be ordained in ministry, but there were some great professors who believed in us. And I would say that's where the thought began. Maybe I could do this. Was in seminary.
Meghan DeJong, I'm wondering if you could answer the same question for us. Tell us, how did you get into ministry? How did you discern a call? What did that process look like for you?
You know, I also grew up in the church, but I always knew that I could be a pastor if I wanted to. I had seen women pastors my whole life. I grew up in the Covenant Church, and they had been ordaining women before I was born. However, my mom worked in ministry, and so that was the absolute last thing that I wanted to do. I just saw how hard that was, and did not want that for my life. So I did a lot of other things that eventually taught me skills that I thought, man, the church really could use these things. I'd better get some theological training so that I can be relevant in these discussions with these pastors. So I went to seminary not thinking that I wanted to be a pastor, not really knowing what I was going to do with that. And God really just worked on my heart there, taught me what it meant to be a pastor as I had been created. And part of that was being a woman, part of that was just being wired the way that I am. But it wasn't ever anything that I felt I couldn't do because I was a woman.
Great.
Yeah.
Abigail, how about you? Can you tell us about your journey in discerning your own ministry call?
Sure. So I grew up in a church that does ordain women, but at the time I was young and growing up in the church, there was no woman leading at that church at the time. So later on, when a woman got the call, I was like, oh, that's a thing. And then kind of moved away from the church, but in high school, really followed my faith on my own and found Christianity not on my own, but through the help of Young Life. And my leader, who was a woman, just was so passionate for the gospel and loving us and sharing God's love for us that it was really impactful in my life and seeing the difference she made out of the strengths that she had. But at that point, I loved serving in Young Life, and then later after college served again as a volunteer. So it's kind of doing ministry in that context, but just kind of, this is kind of what you do. You volunteer in this space and you help out, but never thought about it as like a vocational thing until moving back to the Boston area, and through God's working of things, started working here at Highrock. And that's where I really felt like exploring that call and had people encouraging me to do so and pushing me into ways that were difficult, but really good to get a chance to try. And so really being able to work that out here amidst that culture.
That's great. Megan, I'm going to start with you in the next question. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, what have been some of the best parts of being in ministry?
I think it's just the people. I love being able to journey with people in their really great parts of life and the really hard parts, and just seeing how God shows up in all of those places differently to every different person. My view of God has changed so much just from getting to walk with people in their lives as they experience God. So I think no matter, the highs and lows of a service or a particular season in ministry are really defined in the people for me in those relationships.
Good. Abby, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so very similarly, I think it just really expands your view of God by seeing how God works in different ways in people's lives, very similar to what Megan said. So I echo all of that, and without restating it, I also want to say one of the things I do love about a ministry job is just how dynamic it is. It can be crazy how different each week is, but you get to try so many different things and use so many different skills that I kind of love the dynamicness of the role of working in a church.
Good.
And I'm going to say ditto, 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 ditto. I love the team nature of ministry, the collaborative, working with people, the sense that it's not all on me, that there are people who love God passionately. And I would say the staff teams I've worked with it's just been privilege after privilege to work with people that are just loving God. And people are ministry, and there's also, I would say, a deep sense of it's not boring, it's not reiterative, it's always new, even though many of the things get repeated.
Yes.
Here, you all said that the best part of being in ministry is the people, which I totally corroborate. It's that sense of being able to have this almost unearned intimacy and being invited into people's most vulnerable moments, most sacred moments, the questions with God, a dissolving relationship, a tragic loss, and there's just this incredible holiness in that. And yet if you ask people what the hardest part of ministry is, they almost always answer the same way. It's the people. And so actually, even more broadly than that, I'd be interested to hear, what are some of the obstacles that you've faced in ministry? But actually, I'm wondering if you could even think about it as, what are some of the obstacles that you've faced as a woman in ministry, if that changes it? Adele, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right.
So I'm going to start with the obstacle of my own self-doubt. Because you can get trained to be a pastor, and there is enough sort of questioning of why you're doing that anyway, that you begin to ask yourself, why am I doing this anyway? Why do I think I can do it? And so I want to say throughout my whole ministry, that has been one of the obstacles, is me. That, am I worthy? Can I do it? The other, this isn't an obstacle, but I think it's a reality. I'll just tell a little story. One of the elders at a former church who I just adored was in his 70s. And every time I preached, he would walk out of the church and he would say the same thing to me every time. Wow, you did a great job. I'm so surprised. And so there's this sense, I feel, as a woman in ministry, that men sort of get handed credibility, and you, as a woman, earn it drop by drop. You can lose your credibility if you make some huge mistake, but I've got to earn it just to get the bucket you've got. And that can sometimes feel like, how will I ever do that?
Yeah. Abby?
So I think for me, it seems like there's a lot of agreement already, even though our experiences and our personalities are so different. That myself, I would say, be the biggest obstacle. Even though externally there's been so much support and like asking me to do things where it's like, I feel like the freshman on the varsity team sometimes, like, why am I here? I'm not where everybody else is yet. So that my own doubt or comparison, I feel like can be a huge obstacle. Or just small comments that people make or that you heard have been made to another woman. I remember when I was going to speak up front for the first time, another female pastor said, hey, just be prepared. You're going to spend a lot of time working on what you have to say. And the first thing somebody's going to say to you is, wow, you looked really great today. And so there's that, you hear the stories and there's that, will that be my experience, and kind of preparing for it. And so there is a sense of kind of like steeling yourself to be ready to love the person who comes to you. But so I think there's a little bit of the preparation of what is my experience going to be. But then there's also the internal battle with self-doubt. Even if everything around you looks like it should be really supportive, there's still a lot from experience growing up, or the way that you perceived yourself or have been perceived, that you carry into the space, even if it's welcoming.
That's right.
I think for me it's been more around what folks have expected a woman to be like. It's either been, oh, you don't have a chip on your shoulder, I'm surprised. Most women in ministry seem to have some like bone to pick. Or don't you have like too much to do with your kids? How could you be available to be a pastor for me? Not asking questions necessarily to understand my journey, to understand how the dynamic in my marriage works, so that we co-parent. Those are all things that I think come from other people's expectations of what it means to be a woman, and then particular to be a woman in ministry, instead of being curious around it or around who I am, like to generalize. And so, again, it's okay, how do I respond in the love that I know that God has for this person, instead of maybe my gut reaction to just sort of be like, well, you don't know me, so, oh well.
As a man, nobody ever has said to me afterwards that I looked good, and I'm now just deciding that's because I'm a man. Otherwise, they might have, perhaps. One can only hope. But despite all of the encouragement that I've gotten along the way, just like you say, I'm given all this credibility and I'm given an opportunity that I don't have to earn, I think, because I'm a man. I think you're right. But I'll tell you, the reality is that as a man in ministry, my own insecurity would also be that the kind of the biggest obstacle. I just think it's part of the spiritual dynamic of being in ministry is that Satan attacks, and Satan is the accuser, and Satan is always the one who makes us feel inadequate. To be called pastor, to be called a Christian, a child of God, and so I'm constantly bringing that wherever I go, and so I don't know that that's exclusive to women. I just think I probably have less excuse for it because I'm not hearing as many other people echo those voices as maybe some of you have heard, and yet it's still so real because Satan's just as persistent. So with that, I wonder, we're talking about how men and women are actually very similar in ministry in this respect. How do you suspect that men and women might be different in ministry? How is it that beyond the individuals that we end up gaining because of bringing women into ministry, what are are there some general gifts that the church gets in particular from bringing women into ministry?
I think, speaking for myself personally, recognizing that I have had children, I bring something to the table in my understanding of what it means to have physically birthed life, and how I relate to God in that process that a man couldn't relate to. And so instead of seeing that as something that should keep me separate, or thinking that I need to conform to a male-centric vision of God, instead I use that to inform how I see God. And that's been something that has been a gift to me to understand, and something I'm thankful I can bring to the table also for other people.
Good.
Well, I was going to say image of God.
Yep.
that's sort of a soft thing, but male and female, I think that when you have man and woman together speaking the voice of God to the people of God, that it does something to their perception of God. And without it, there's something missing. So they're both needed.
Yes.
So I feel the weight and the goodness of bringing that piece of the image of God. Some of it has to do with what Meghan was saying, the whole mothering image of God and how that's found in Scripture. I think there's also, I may talk out of two sides of my mouth. I feel like there's an approachability in women that we tend to be more vulnerable in what we preach and do, and people can feel like it's easier to approach us, especially women, to approach us. And on the other side, I think there's also this sense of perception at times of being intimidating to women and maybe other people because of either the education or the knowledge, or we're upfront or something. So it's sort of the
authority that's conferred on you.
Yes, so I feel both.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I would agree. And I think that there's so much value in having so many different kinds of women and so many different voices, that there are going to be women who can't have kids, and that experience is going to bring a certain perspective to their understanding of who God is and their journey of God, or being a mom or losing a spouse. And Meghan and I joke all the time how different we are. We are just so extraordinarily different in our ice cream preferences in so many different ways that we just bring so much, such a different voice into whatever we're discussing or how we see God. That I think that adds a lot.
Good. I'm interested to know, what are some of the ways that, it's easy for us to catalog some of the ways that the church has discouraged women from responding to God's call in their lives, if it's a call towards ministry, and especially professional ministry. What are some of the ways that you've experienced the church being used to affirm you or encourage you along this pathway? Or, if perhaps this is the easier answer for you, are there some ways that the church could encourage you, some opportunities that are being missed, that people just might not know they could do or would be needed? So, ways you've either been encouraged through the church or would love to be encouraged, love to see future women entering into ministry being encouraged. Adele.
So I feel like it hasn't been, in some ways, the church. It has been specific male pastors that have made it possible for me to be a pastor, who have looked at their church, the churches I've been in, that were not in a place at the time to even have women elders, taken the church through the women elders process, then the women's ordination process, and been my advocate the whole way along. And only after the senior pastor took the bull by the horns and walked with the congregation through these things, both at Park Street and at Christ Church, did I feel like the church, like at the ordination, or when I could stand as a body and say, this is a good thing. But it's only after a bunch of people walked out the door. So.
I think for me it has been specific people, but also feeling systemic supports around the gift that has been offered to me to step into this role. I always saw female leaders at churches and in Christian camping. I was taught by female professors who lived into their own female identity while also being pastoral. So just seeing that as normative has been very, very helpful. I think for me, learning gender neutral language around how to talk about God has been also helpful. I still am not entirely comfortable with using female language for God, say like Mother God or something like that. It's something I'm working on, but even to just use gender neutral language, I've been more aware of how impactful that was for me to grow up not hearing about God always as Him. And so now hearing it sometimes more, I'm like, whoa, I didn't even realize that this was something that had formed me. And my understanding of God. But I do think people just saying like, yeah, you belong here. This is normal, has been really good.
Good.
Yeah.
What about you, Abby?
So for me, I feel like my experience has been at Highrock in kind of discerning this call, but just I feel like people taking a chance on me and allowing me to shift into my different gifts has felt really affirming. Even when I couldn't, usually it felt like they were being affirmed by someone else, and I had to like learn to trust that affirmation. How you see that in me? Okay, like I really trust you, and let me try to grow into that, and kind of seeing that the community kind of teasing out and helping me to see things that maybe I wasn't going to be able to see on my own. And I would say that a way that the church could continue to support and I think make space would be, as much as I love conversations about women in ministry, but to also be felt like you're a person in ministry, that I'm not just a part of a team. And I haven't felt this here, but I think it could be easy to say like, well, we need more women. Yes, we do, but we need a person too, and that you're not just kind of filling a space or the voice of all women,
Yes.
And that you're valuable because of who you are, not just because of the gender that you bring to the table, which I think is important, and each of us experience our genders differently in the way we grew up. But I think having that, like I'm a woman, and that's great, and I love that, but also to be felt like you're a person at the table, and I think affirming that and just being intentional about that.
You know, earlier Adele had mentioned that men are given credibility sort of out of the gate, and women have to earn it, you know, piece by piece by piece. And I wonder if there are ways that you all have felt that people have questioned your motives, or you know, so you're as you were discerning a call or practicing it, that people have not just questioned theologically, is this allowed, but actually more personally, kind of, why are you doing this in a challenging way? For me, as a man in ministry, nobody ever questioned that. You know, that was a if I were to float that idea, people acknowledged it as sort of a noble ambition. And yet, my experience has been that women don't always get that same reception, and I'm wondering what has been your experience.
Go for it.
Go? Okay. I feel like there's been a lot of overt support, and I'm so grateful for that. But then there are those little, as a friend calls them, those little paper cut comments that just kind of hurt a little bit. Whether it's people always asking, "Hey, where are your kids?" or "Where's your daughter?" It's like, well, I'm working right now. You know, she's with my husband, and so there's a sense of like you're a mom first, or you kind of, where does your identity lie? And I know that comment doesn't mean anything, but there's an internalizing. And so there's some comments that I think build up like that, that can question that. Or, you know, around other people that work in a church, they always ask, are you doing children's ministry? And that's always the assumption, is that if you're working for a church, that you're working in children's ministry. And it's like, well, no, I'm doing these other things, and, you know, kind of explain what you do. And there's like, oh, interesting. And how do they receive that? And feeling confident enough to kind of speak what I do and what I enjoy doing at the church, because you're not sure how it's going to be received. Somebody else is going to agree that you should be in that role. And it's like there's always a little elephant kind of following that around.
Yeah, I got the same sort of thing. Like, well, if you go do this, it's going to be a lot. Who's going to take care of your kids? Are your children going to suffer? And that was even from people who were very excited that I was doing that with my life. But it was always the caveat that was offered, like about the welfare of my kids. And I don't think that anyone asked that about my husband when he got a full-time job. So that was, it's just something I was aware of, and I understood that it came from a place of concern and care. So I could take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, just if you hear it all the time, it's hard to not just say like, well, did you ask Brad? But they didn't.
I would say the kinds of questions that I would get, so I'm a generation at least ahead of both of these women, was show me in the Bible where you can do this first. why couldn't you be happy just serving? I mean, it's a privilege to serve. Why do you feel you need this extra thing, or you need to preach, or you need something else? And is that your ego? What other questions? And then if, one of the best ones, I think, is there are so many people to reach in this world. Why do you even care about women having a position? That just derails the whole train, takes a lot of energy away from momentum. It feels like you're putting drag on the whole system. Can we just, this isn't a salvific issue. Let's just take that off the table and let's go for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And those kinds of things, early on, I would say, okay, if I'm going to have a voice in this system, there's a way I need to not make that my issue. Because if I make that my issue, I will lose my hearing completely in this system. So I did some self-muting, and I still have ambivalence about doing that, but I feel like it did give me credibility, so that when I was ordained, it didn't come with this sense of, well, you were the push behind this, you were the make this happen. But there's also in me, I would have to say, a deep feeling of sadness that had to be. When I think about 50% of the world not being invited into their God-given gifting and ability, and how I advocate for that. So I have experienced deep tension in that area.
Well, this has been really rich. I'm so thankful you all are sharing this with us today. I will say, Adele had mentioned that there are people who question this and, is this biblical? If that's a question you have, there are so many great resources for that, but probably none more easily accessible than the sermon we heard this past Sunday from Pastor John. I encourage you to download that off the Highrock Arlington website. And just allow John to lead you through the scriptures to be able to see why this is not some new teaching. This is actually something that has been from the beginning that in our sin, I think the church really lost sight of. And so anyway, we encourage you to check that out. But I want to say a special thanks to you, not just for being here today, but for being pastors in our church. There are so many ways that I personally have been blessed by God through you. And I know that my family has been blessed by God through you. And you all are ministers of the gospel. And I'm so thankful that we're friends and that we're colleagues and family in Christ. So anyway, thank you for being here today. And thank you for joining us on this podcast. And we'll look forward to seeing you in a future episode.